This is a video that will show us how to sew buttonholes on a piece of fabric. So like where you typically find buttonholes is along an opening or like a closure so that you can enter and exit a garment. We are just going to be doing a sample, but you can kind of treat it like a center front of a bodice or along, like if you were going to have a button opening along the side of like your skirt or something, you can kind of treat it like that. So we're going to use this folded edge as our kind of guide. Now I want to point out that you'll probably want to make sure that you have your notes from your construction packet handy and in front of you while you do the buttonhole exercise. And if you haven't taken the time to read this information about fastenings and determining your buttonhole length by using your buttons, I would highly recommend that you do that, because otherwise you're not going to know how long to make your buttonhole. What I did, and when you read through this, you'll see that it's a combination of different parts of your button using some measurements to determine how long your buttonhole is going to be. And so what I did here is I just created kind of like this little chart for each of my buttons, which is a 2-hole, a 4-hole, and a shank. And these are the buttons that I have purchased for class. As you can see, they are different sizes. This is my shank button, and you can also see that it has a curvature to it, and so we kind of call this a ball button because it balls out. So it's not a flat button. My 2-hole button is flat, and my 4-hole button is flat, but it is smaller. So each of these require a slightly different buttonhole length. And what I did was I made this chart and I just labeled it 2-hole, 4-hole, and shank. One column is diameter, one column is height or thickness of the button, and the last column is just 1/8 of an inch, because you have to add 1/8 of an inch onto the length of your buttonhole. And you'll, if you haven't taken the time to read it yet, I would do that now, and then you'll understand what I'm saying. And then I have this kind of total column over here for what my button length needs to be. So I would go ahead and take the time to kind of make a little chart for each of your buttons so that you know how to, what each buttonhole length needs to be. Your construction packet, as I'm sure that you were reading along, it says that it's always wise to do a sample buttonhole. So that's what I am doing right now. I've done one sample for my 4-hole and one sample for my 2-hole button, and I'm going to demonstrate my shank button here in a moment. But before we get going, I want you to make sure that you have a copy of the instructional book that goes along with the sewing machines that we're going to be using in class. I went in and grabbed one of the zipper, or not the zipper feet, but the buttonhole feet that we'll be using. As you can see, it slides back and forth along the length of your buttonhole. My buttons are actually fairly big for this foot, so I'll have to move it as I go along. But if you have smaller buttons, I would say, you know, 1/2 inch to 3/4 inches in diameter, the distance across your button, then you shouldn't have any problem with needing to adjust this. But if your buttons are over that, then you're just going to want to pay attention to these markings and how your buttonhole foot is moving as we stitch the buttonhole. So go grab this manual from the front of the class, because every machine is particular about the way that it does the buttonhole. I have my manual here with me, and what I'm having to do to go through this demonstration is I need to kind of do a combination of where, you know, what we do for your machine and what my machine will do, because the way that mine is programmed, my buttonhole machine, or like my buttonhole foot, wants to go from front to back. But as you'll read in your step-by-step how to sew a buttonhole and the different measurements, and using your selector knob and your stitch length knob to select the right settings to do your buttonhole, you're actually going to be going from back to front. So if you're doing this at home, you really need, like if you're using your home machine, you really need to pull out your manual, go to the table of contents, see where they talk about buttonholes, and then go through that reading in your manual so that you know what to do and how to adjust your settings for your personal machine. I know that it might be a little bit hard to see, but on your selector knob, you have 3 different settings, and the blackened in areas are where the stitches are going to take place. So setting number 1 is that it is it's going to do a very tight zigzag along the left-hand side of your buttonhole. Setting 2 and 4 are the bar tacks on the front and end of the buttonhole, and 3 is along the right-hand side. So since you're going to have this in front of you, I'm going to go through a sample of this, but what I would suggest doing is I would do a sample for each of your buttons, not on your actual sample that you'll turn in, but just as a practice to make sure that you know how to use your buttonhole foot, you have the settings right, you have your measurements correct, because the last thing that you'd want to do is mess up on your sample that you're going to turn in just because you didn't take the time to familiarize yourself with this process. So, and if you need some sample fabric, what I did was I just had a piece of that 3.5 by 6 rectangle fabric that I just cut extras of from back in previous samples. What I did was I folded it in half because I want the fabric to be double thickness, because when we actually sew a buttonhole, we're going to have 2 layers of fabric involved. It's either 2 layers of the fabric or the fabric and a layer of interfacing. So either way, there's 2 layers of something involved to help support the zigzag structure, because this is a buttonhole will get a lot of use because you're going to be pushing buttons through it every time you go to put that garment on and off. So it's important that we have a little bit more stabilization than just 1 layer of fabric. But anyway, there's some sample scraps both in the muslin bin as well as in the fashion fabric bin in the back of the class. So take the time to do this step. You will thank me later. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and just demonstrate quickly how to do a sample of the shank, and according to my shank. And my measurements were that my buttonhole length should be 1 inch and 3/8. So everyone, again, is going to have particular lengths that are unique to them. So I would just make sure that you take the time to measure and just note that stuff so that when you complete the sample, you can go back and make sure that everything does work. Now, the first thing that you're going to want to do is you want to make sure that your thread, like your top thread that comes out of your needle, is that it's underneath of your foot. So what I did was I just lowered my needle down a little bit. I used the tip of my scissors and I just slid that thread out underneath so that both my bobbin and my top thread are underneath the buttonhole foot. Now what I'm going to do, and again, this is, you're going to be lining up your position different, and it's all because of the way that our machines are programmed. So you're going to line up your buttonhole foot at the back of your markings, and I have to line up mine at the front, and that's just because that's the way my machine is. And I'm also going to have to pay attention to where this foot slides and guides as it stitches, because my shank button is awfully long. It's awfully big compared to other buttons that have a shank on them. So I just have to kind of pay attention to the slider, and you'll kind of see that as we go. So first I want to make sure that my machine is set to actually do that buttonhole stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust that now, and make sure that you have your buttonhole foot snapped on. And you want to make sure that there's kind of these prongs in the front and this prong in the back. And those are for if you ever do like a corded buttonhole and you want to put some sort of thick cording in. We're not going to be sampling that in class, but that's what they're for. And you want to snap down your buttonhole foot so that the 2 prongs are in front and the 1 prong is in the back. Then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and lower my needle into the fabric right at where my markings are. And then I'm just going to go ahead and stitch, and the machine is automatically going to do the proper width and the proper length of that zigzag to go along the buttonhole. Now both of us are going to be doing the left-hand side of our buttonhole first. Now here's where I'm going to stop, because the part of the buttonhole foot that is snapped into that arm of the presser foot that goes up and down, the part that's connected to there, this white part of my slider is all the way to the back, or it's close to the back of the distance of the length of this buttonhole foot, and I need it to go longer because my button is so big. So what I need to do is I need to adjust that and slide it back forward. If you are using a large button, you'd probably have to slide it also just in the opposite direction, because that's how our machines are set up. So once I get that adjusted, again, like, I want to point out that my needle was in the down position when I stopped to do that. So I'm just going to continue going right along the center line of my marking that I had put on here. And I'm just going to keep going, and it looks like I might need to adjust it again just a little bit more. I only have maybe about 2/8 left to go, and then I see the end marking that I drew to indicate where my buttonhole needed to stop. Then I'm going to switch my selector knob, and you'd be selecting yours to the 2-4, and it's going to put a bar tack at the end. Now this is, it's tacking, and mine does a slightly different, but it'll do a bar tack, and so just hang on with me while I have to do this special step for my machine. But then as it gets to the front, or when you get to the stopping point for either the front or the back of your buttonhole, and then your machine is going to do what's called a bar tack, or a tacking mechanism to finish off and give some extra strength and stabilization at that front end of your buttonhole as well as at the back. And then you're going to reset your selector knob to do setting 3, which is to sew along the right hand side of your buttonhole. So my setting is doing that right now, and I'm just going back along that right side of my buttonhole, and I'm slowing down because I know I'm getting to the end. At least I'm close to where I know my buttonhole is going to be, the end point of it. And then I'm going to adjust my selector knob back to setting 4 to do that bar tack at the very end. Alright. And your manual says, it tells you exactly how many stitches to do that bar tack in, what direction to move things. So if you're having problems with following this, please let me know, but it's fairly straightforward. It has a step-by-step direction. Just make sure that you're following the right numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's pictures to go along with that. Then it jumps down to 5, 6, 7, and then 8. Okay, so just reference that book as you go, and this is a good habit for any machine you ever end up on the rest of your life, because every machine is going to be a little bit different. Alright, so I'm just going to zoom in. This is the buttonhole that we just stitched, and as you can see, it has zigzag along the left side, a bar tack at the end, zigzag along the right, bar tack at the end. And then your book says that you can go ahead and use your seam ripper. I would be very cautious about this just because I have put a little too much muscle behind my seam ripper, and I have like seam ripped open a buttonhole, and that is not good. So what your book says you can do is you can just slide your seam ripper right into the end and gently rip this open, but that personally is too chancy for me. So what I would do is I would take your embroidery snips or another small set of scissors and then just cut it open, because the last thing you would want to do on a project is to seam rip this button open, and then you're like, what am I going to do? And the answer is you're probably going to need to recut that piece, and that's that takes time, and that's, extra fabric and stuff. So I'm going to go back, and I hadn't cut these other buttonholes open yet. And I also want to just kind of point out that I did I labeled all of mine, so 4-hole, 2-hole, and S for shank. And then I also indicated a center front line just to give me a guide, because when you line up your buttonhole, the front end of that buttonhole, the part that, if this were a shirt, this would be overlapping on the right, and this is like the actual center front line, so we have this extension that extends over onto the left front of our bodice. So I'm going to go ahead and snip this last one, and again, like when you line up the very edge of your buttonhole, and this is outlined in your construction packet, word for word, you want to start one end of your buttonhole 1/8 of an inch inward towards the fabric edge, so that folded edge of your buttonhole, then measure backwards, so it's 1/8 of an inch over from that center front line. Now, just to give you a quick demonstration on how these buttonholes work, like you should be able to freely slide your button through. So this is my shank button, and I had to have that extra long buttonhole to accommodate for the ball or the curved shaping of the button itself. And it should just it should fit fairly, I'm going to say fairly snug, but you shouldn't have to force this button to go through, but it should fit just within those openings of the tab. So there's my shank button. And you want to take the time to do this so that you know that all of your measurements are correct. Alright, and there's my 2-hole button. Everything seems to be sliding clear, and then here's my 4-hole button. Alright, so everything is clear to go there. If anything, I could have probably, and I might have just gone a little too long on this 4-hole button. It looks like maybe a 1/16 of an inch too long, but it's not too bad. Alright, so this is my sample. I'm going to go ahead and stop the video, and I'm going to start the next one up of us actually doing our buttonhole sample that you'll turn in. But I'm going to go ahead and put this in my binder so that I can see that I practiced and did this step. And again, make sure that you have your manual in front of you. Make sure that you have the right the foot that you need, and this is the buttonhole foot. And I would also, if you haven't read through the fastening information on how to measure and mark, do that right now, okay?